It was a typical morning in the small town of Maplewood. The sun was already lighting up the quiet streets when the first police officers arrived at the Murphy residence. News spread quickly, like wildfire, and soon the whole neighborhood knew Laura Murphy, 23, had disappeared. In her room, on top of the messy bed, was a crumpled note with just one line: "I've been kidnapped. Don't look for me." Laura's mother was devastated, sitting on the edge of the bed, unable to comprehend what was happening. The police were combing the place, looking for any clues. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle, nothing out of place. The house looked normal, as if Laura had just gone for a walk and never returned. Carlos Bennett, the detective in charge of the town's Special Cases Unit, was called to the scene. He was a man with years of experience in handling complex investigations, but from the start, something about this case felt different. As he entered the room, Carlos stared at the note. The crumpled paper, the hastily scribbled words, it didn't make sense. He'd seen situations like this before, but something bothered him. It was as if Laura's disappearance was more than just a kidnapping. The first interviews with neighbors and family didn't reveal much. Laura's mother, a middle-aged woman named Karen, was emotionally crumbling. She couldn't think of anyone who would want to harm her daughter. Laura's father, Tom, was also in shock. Both parents insisted Laura was a normal young woman, studious, and with no apparent problems. However, an air of uncertainty lingered. The town of Maplewood wasn't known for serious crimes, especially anything like this. A mysterious disappearance shook the residents. The last time something like this happened was over a decade ago, and even then, it was nowhere near as disturbing as a young woman vanishing without a trace. Carlos spoke with Laura's close friends. They described her as a quiet but kind girl. Recently, though, some noticed she seemed distracted, more withdrawn than usual. She kept looking over her shoulder, like she was nervous, one of her friends mentioned. But no one had any concrete information on what could have been bothering her. In the days following her disappearance, the Maplewood police mobilized to try and find any clues that might lead to Laura. Co-workers, acquaintances, and even people with whom she had brief interactions, like store clerks and cafe workers, were interviewed. No solid leads emerged. However, Carlos had a nagging feeling that the note was a red herring, though it was too early to draw any conclusions. As the week dragged on, the investigation began to lose momentum. No new leads, no suspects, and no ransom request. The case was growing more mysterious by the day. It was as if Laura had simply vanished into thin air. But Carlos couldn't let the case go. He spent his nights revisiting the evidence. Something about that note still bothered him. The words felt desperate but hurried, like they'd been written in haste, without much care. He reread the note and noticed something he hadn't caught before. The ink seemed too fresh to have been written in the middle of the night, when she supposedly disappeared. The family began fearing the worst. Days turned into weeks, and the leads dried up. But for Carlos, this was only the beginning of a much more complicated investigation than anyone had anticipated. The first week after Laura's disappearance brought few answers. Carlos, now deeply invested in the case, spent his nights combing through every detail of her life. He knew that a kidnapping without a ransom request was unusual, and something about the note still seemed off. The handwriting looked familiar, but the style was rushed, disjointed, as if someone had been forced to write it, or as if Laura was trying to deceive someone. Based on the initial interviews, Carlos decided to dig deeper into Laura's behavior in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. He started with her closest friends, the people who knew her best. His first visit was with Emily, a young woman who studied with Laura at the local college. Emily greeted him with tired, worried eyes, sitting on the small living room couch. "I already told the police everything I knew, but Laura, lately, she was different. More withdrawn. She wouldn't respond to my texts and seemed suspicious when we met up, Emily explained. Did you notice any change in her behavior over the last few weeks? Anything that stood out? Carlos asked. Emily thought for a moment before responding. Well, there was something. She always seemed to be looking over her shoulder, like she was afraid someone was following her. And then, she suddenly stopped going out at night. She even mentioned once that she was thinking of moving far away. Carlos jotted down the details. Something in Laura's routine had radically changed. This only confirmed his suspicion that her disappearance wasn't a typical kidnapping but a planned escape driven by someone in a panic. Emily gave Carlos a name that caught his attention, Jake Patterson, a guy Laura had been seeing occasionally. Carlos' next stop was Jake's house. He was a young man of average appearance, visibly nervous at the sight of a detective on his doorstep. During the conversation, Jake revealed that Laura had mentioned leaving town, but she didn't seem willing to explain why. She was different those last few weeks. We barely talked. She didn't say much, always distracted by her phone, like she was expecting an important message, Jake said. Carlos sensed there was more to the story, but Jake seemed genuinely clueless about what Laura was going through. With this in mind, Carlos returned to the station to review Laura's phone records and messages. That's when something unusual came up. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Laura had been exchanging frequent messages with an unknown number. These messages, however, were strange. Some were encrypted, as if they were part of a coded conversation. Others were direct, telling Laura to be careful and to avoid certain people. Carlos knew this was the first solid clue he had found. But who was sending these messages to Laura? Determined to find out, Carlos traced the number. However, he hit a dead end when the signal was blocked by a series of proxies, indicating that Laura had been communicating with someone who knew exactly how to hide their identity. This confirmed that Laura was involved in something much bigger than anyone had imagined. At the same time, Carlos revisited the scene of the disappearance. Nothing had changed at the Murphy home. The sense of calm, almost eerie, still lingered over the place. However, when he examined Laura's room again, he found a detail that had gone unnoticed during the initial investigation, a small box hidden behind one of the desk drawers. Inside, there was a passport, cash, and a bus ticket for a destination more than 500 kilometers away. Laura hadn't just planned to leave town, she was ready to completely disappear. Carlos knew this new discovery changed the entire narrative. There was no longer any doubt that Laura had planned her own escape, but the question he still couldn't answer was, what, or who, was she running from? As he delved deeper into the case, the feeling that he was being led through a maze of false clues and misleading information only intensified. Laura clearly had a double life, and the mystery surrounding her grew thicker by the day. Armed with new information, Carlos followed the only solid lead he had, the bus ticket. He went to the Maplewood station and checked the security footage. There she was, wearing a large coat and a hood that covered part of her face, buying the ticket. She seemed calm, showing no signs of immediate danger. The date on the ticket matched the day of her disappearance, but there were no more recordings after she left the counter. Once again, Laura's trail evaporated before his eyes. But for Carlos, this only confirmed one thing: she was running from something, and now, he needed to figure out exactly what. With his mind full of new questions, Carlos knew this case was far from being solved. Laura had disappeared voluntarily, but what terrified her so much that she needed to hide so well? And why was someone helping her escape? The answers were still out there, but the detective was beginning to realize he was dealing with something far darker and more intricate than anyone had anticipated. The investigation into Laura's disappearance was growing more tangled with each passing day. Now, with the certainty that Laura had planned her own escape, Carlos Bennett knew the next step was to understand why she had gone to such lengths to hide. Though he had tracked her bus ticket, Laura's whereabouts remained a mystery. Carlos focused on the last few messages she had exchanged with the anonymous number. The fact that the messages were encrypted indicated that Laura was in contact with someone who knew how to operate below the radar of the law. This suggested something bigger. Perhaps she was involved with a group working outside the system, or worse, she was being used as a pawn in a dangerous game. Determined to uncover more about this shadowy network of contacts, Carlos went to Laura's university, where he started digging into her circle of friends and her online activities. He discovered that Laura had distanced herself from several close friends in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, especially the ones she used to confide in the most. That same suspicious behavior, constantly looking over her shoulder and avoiding certain places, was mentioned repeatedly in interviews. It was clear, Laura knew she was being watched. The question was, by whom? Meanwhile, Carlos decided to follow up on a lead that had been bothering him from the start, the mysterious phone number Laura had been communicating with. He managed to use unconventional methods to trace a web of virtual interactions that revealed something unsettling. The unknown number had not only been communicating frequently with Laura but with other suspicious users as well, all connected to forums and online communities discussing dark topics. Among them, blackmail and constant surveillance seemed to be common themes. Still, the trail remained cold. The mystery surrounding Laura and her reason for vanishing was like a web, and every new thread Carlos pulled only led to more questions. He felt like he was being led down a path Laura herself had created, confusing any potential pursuers, including him. That's when he had an idea. Carlos revisited the bus station footage, focusing on the small details of what Laura had been wearing. The large coat and hood had caught his attention before, but now something else stood out. Laura looked too calm for someone on the run. There was no rush in her movements. Her behavior suggested she knew exactly what she was doing and that she had a well-structured plan. Carlos realized that for such a well-executed escape, Laura had to have had outside help. Determined to uncover more, he began following a new line of investigation, this time focusing on where Laura might have gone into hiding. He checked security cameras at key points along possible routes, but every search came up empty. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Frustrated, Carlos decided to go back to investigating Laura's online behavior. He knew that the virtual world often hid far more than the physical one. After hours of digging, he finally came across something that caught his attention, a fake profile that Laura appeared to have been using to communicate on a private discussion forum. There, she had been talking about how to protect herself and disappear without leaving a trace. As he dug deeper into this profile, Carlos began piecing things together. Laura had been involved with people who operated in the shadows, helping others escape dangerous situations. She wasn't just running from something. She was preparing for a confrontation she knew would come. However, one final piece of the puzzle remained: who or what was making Laura hide? What had pushed her to such extreme methods? Was the threat really that big? Carlos was getting closer to the truth, but it still seemed out of reach. As he analyzed the new data, Carlos had an epiphany. He realized that he had been looking for Laura in the wrong places. She wasn't just trying to disappear, she was hiding from something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. And the person or people from whom she was fleeing were willing to do anything to make sure she stayed hidden. The race against time was intensifying. Carlos knew that if Laura's suspicions were right, he, too, was getting dangerously close to the same threat that had driven her to run. Carlos Bennett was close to wrapping up the case. With most of the clues pointing to Laura running away from an abusive relationship, likely hiding on her own terms, the authorities were ready to file it away as a non-criminal disappearance. Still, something kept nagging at Carlos. The detective knew things weren't quite adding up the way they seemed. The conversation with Jake Patterson had left many questions unanswered. Jake, the guy Laura had been seeing over the past few months, admitted that Laura had been acting strange. He mentioned she seemed paranoid, constantly on edge, but wasn't able to provide many more details. Carlos replayed the conversation in his mind, searching for anything he might have missed. Jake recalled one particular moment when Laura, during a casual chat, had said she was thinking of disappearing for a while, but he hadn't taken it seriously. Carlos thought about this as he stared at the note Laura had left, now sealed as evidence. There was something strange about the handwriting. It didn't seem like the kind of message someone in immediate danger would leave. The note felt deliberate but distant, as if Laura wanted it to be found but wasn't telling the whole story. Even so, the investigation followed the simplest narrative: Laura had run away. The town of Maplewood slowly returned to its routine, and Laura's parents, although still shaken, began to accept that their daughter had chosen to disappear. The police department was ready to move on, and Carlos was pressured to close the case. Then he got a call. The voice on the other end was calm, but clearly distorted by a voice modulator. "You're wrong, detective," the voice said. "Laura didn't run from Jake. She's hiding from something much bigger, something you haven't even seen yet. And now, you're getting too close." A chill ran down Carlos's spine. The phone call not only brought a thinly veiled threat, but it confirmed his suspicions: there was something else going on. He had known it all along, but now, he was certain. The feeling that he was being manipulated into drawing the wrong conclusion grew stronger. Laura's disappearance wasn't just a runaway case. It was something much more dangerous, and now, Carlos was tangled in it too. Determined to reopen the case, Carlos began re-examining the evidence. He went back to the beginning, reviewing the footage from the bus station where Laura had bought her ticket on the day of her disappearance. As he watched the recordings again, something caught his eye. There, in the background, was a figure, a man in a dark coat, almost invisible in the shadows, but clearly watching Laura from a distance. Carlos paused the video, zooming in on the man. What had seemed like a random passerby now looked crucial. This observer wasn't a coincidence. He was there for Laura, and Carlos was certain this was the missing piece he had been looking for. He sent the footage to the department's tech team, asking them to analyze the video and try to identify the man, though he knew it would take time. While waiting for answers, Carlos returned to the burner phone Laura had been using in the weeks before her disappearance. He dove deeper into the encrypted messages exchanged between Laura and the mysterious contact. Although many of them were unreadable, some messages made it clear that Laura had been receiving instructions. There were warnings to avoid certain places, certain people, and even tips on how to disappear without leaving a trace. Whoever was sending these messages wasn't just helping Laura run, they were protecting her from something or someone. This new information painted a clearer picture. Laura wasn't simply trying to get away from Jake or escape a toxic relationship. She was being hunted, watched, and she knew it. Her decision to disappear was meticulous, aided by someone who had a deep understanding of how to evade detection. That's when the case took another sharp turn. The tech team managed to partially identify the man in the bus station footage. While most of his face remained hidden, they had traced his movements. He hadn't just been at the bus station that day, he had been caught on other cameras around town in the weeks leading up to Laura's disappearance, always lingering nearby, always watching from a distance. With this new information, Carlos began connecting the dots. Laura wasn't just fleeing from a personal problem, she was caught in something bigger, a network of people watching her and perhaps even manipulating her actions. She had been under close surveillance, and her only way out was to disappear. But now, Carlos was convinced that Laura's disappearance was just the beginning of something much larger. He didn't know how far this conspiracy reached, but he knew he was now in the middle of it. Carlos spent the entire night going over the case again in his mind. The connection between Laura and the man in the footage was still vague, but he knew he was getting closer to the truth. As the hours passed, he revisited every detail of the disappearance, realizing that what had first seemed like a simple case of running away had transformed into an intricate web of secrets. But one question remained unanswered: why Laura? What did she know, or what had she done, that put her at the center of such a relentless pursuit? And who were the people trying to find her, controlling her life, and now threatening Carlos as well? With the sense that time was running out, Carlos made a decision. He needed to follow the one solid lead he had: the man in the dark coat. He knew finding this man could be the key to unlocking what was really happening to Laura, and why he himself was now being pulled into this dangerous web. Carlos felt the weight of the investigation growing heavier with each passing day. The anonymous phone call had shifted the entire case, making it much bigger than he could have ever imagined. The man in the dark coat, identified in the bus station footage, was the key he had been searching for, but the leads were still thin. He knew he was being watched, but the full extent of the threat remained a mystery. Determined not to be caught off guard, Carlos began taking precautions. He reinforced the security around his house and avoided predictable routes in his daily routine. The fear of being followed was justified. The mysterious phone call still echoed in his mind: "You're getting too close." Whatever was behind Laura's disappearance now involved Carlos directly. While waiting for new information on the mysterious man, Carlos decided to dig deeper into Laura's movements in the weeks before she disappeared. He knew that simply buying a bus ticket couldn't have been the end of her plan. Laura had been preparing for something much larger, and surely, there were more clues. Carlos returned to the university where Laura had been studying and checked the records of her attendance in the days leading up to her disappearance. He found something interesting: Laura had missed several classes, which was completely out of character for her. Moreover, logs of her online activity showed that she had accessed forums dedicated to personal security, using aliases that made it hard to track her. Then, a new piece of the puzzle emerged. Carlos received an anonymous email. The message was short and direct: "She's alive, but she won't be for long if you keep digging. Stop now." Attached to the email was a photo of Laura, walking quickly down an unfamiliar street. The image was grainy, but there was no mistaking it: it was Laura. The setting appeared to be a small, remote town, far from Maplewood. Carlos felt a jolt of realization. It was the first concrete proof that Laura was still alive since she had disappeared. But now the stakes were even higher. Someone was not only aware of his progress but willing to warn him off. The threat was clear: back off or face the consequences. But who were these people? And how had Laura gotten herself involved in something so dangerous? With the pressure mounting, Carlos knew he couldn't trust anyone. He decided to follow the only new lead he had: the photograph. He began investigating the characteristics of the town in the background of the picture. He carefully examined the buildings and signs visible in the shot, trying to identify the location. Using maps of nearby towns and software that matched visual landmarks, Carlos finally pinpointed the place. It was a small, isolated town about 200 kilometers from Maplewood, the perfect place for someone trying to hide. Carlos packed his things quickly and decided to go to the town without notifying his superiors or anyone else. He knew that if he alerted the wrong person, it might tip off those behind this conspiracy. The drive was long and silent, his mind focused on the possibility of finding Laura alive and in danger. Upon arriving in the small town, Carlos followed his instincts. He walked through the streets, searching for any sign of Laura or the location where the photo might have been taken. After hours of searching, he finally found the building that matched the image. It was an abandoned store, its windows covered in dust and graffiti. Something about the place felt wrong, as though it wasn't as empty as it seemed. Carlos entered the building carefully, his hand on his gun, ready for anything. The silence inside was suffocating. The floor creaked under his feet as he moved through the darkened corridors. Then, in the back of the building, he heard a faint sound. Someone was there. He followed the noise to a locked door at the far end of the hall. With caution, he forced the lock and opened the door. Inside the dimly lit room, he found a shocking sight: Laura, sitting in a corner, exhausted and scared, but alive. She looked up and immediately recognized him. "Carlos?" she whispered, her voice weak. He rushed to her side, helping her to her feet. "Are you okay?" he asked, quickly checking her for injuries. She was visibly shaken but not seriously hurt. "We don't have much time," Laura said, her voice trembling with fear and exhaustion. "They'll be back soon. I managed to escape, but they're still after me." Carlos felt a knot forming in his stomach. "Who are they, Laura? What are you running from?" Laura took a deep breath, struggling to find the words. "I discovered something. Something I wasn't supposed to. I was working on a university project, investigating illegal financial transfers. I thought it was just a mistake, but the more I dug, the more dangerous it became. I uncovered names, important people. And then they came after me." Carlos immediately understood. Laura had stumbled upon a conspiracy much bigger than anyone had realized. She had become a threat, and now the people behind the transfers were determined to silence her. "We need to get out of here, now," Carlos said, pulling Laura toward the exit. But before they could make it out, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. They weren't alone. Carlos Bennett and Laura moved quickly through the abandoned building, the sound of footsteps closing in behind them. They knew they had to get out before their pursuers found them. These were the same people who had been chasing Laura, the ones she had referred to as them. Carlos still didn't fully grasp the scale of the conspiracy Laura had uncovered, but he knew the danger was real and immediate. As Carlos guided Laura through the dark corridors, he replayed everything she had told him. Laura had stumbled upon illegal financial transfers linked to powerful people through a project at the university. As she dug deeper, she had become a target. Now, those people were determined to silence her, and Carlos, now entangled in the same web, was a target as well. The situation was growing more dangerous by the second. They reached a side door, but before they could escape, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the man in the dark coat, the same man Carlos had spotted in the bus station footage. He stood silently, blocking their path, holding a gun that left no room for negotiation. Carlos quickly shoved Laura behind him, shielding her with his body. "What do you want?" Carlos demanded, his hand hovering over his own gun, ready to draw but knowing he had to be careful. The man said nothing. His cold stare and the gun in his hand made his intentions clear. Carlos could sense they were running out of options. "You don't have to do this," Carlos said calmly, trying to defuse the situation. "If anything happens to her, everything you're trying to protect will come out. I already have the evidence. If we're not around to explain it, others will find out." The man hesitated for just a moment, but then raised the gun. Carlos knew this was his only chance. In a swift motion, he lunged at the man, shoving him into the wall and knocking the gun out of his hand. The weapon clattered to the floor, and Laura quickly scooped it up, her hands trembling but steady enough to hold the gun aimed at their attacker. "Who's behind this?" Carlos shouted, pinning the man against the wall. "Who's trying to kill Laura?" The man remained silent, his expression emotionless. Even now, with Carlos pressing him for answers, he refused to speak. Carlos knew this man was just a pawn, someone higher up was pulling the strings. There was no point in continuing to question him. Carlos released the man, realizing they had to escape before more of them showed up. Carlos and Laura bolted toward the emergency exit, knowing they had only bought themselves a little more time. Once outside, they jumped into Carlos' car and sped away from the building, the sound of their pursuers' footsteps fading behind them. The night was quiet, but the tension between them was palpable. "You said you found evidence. Who else knows about this?" Carlos asked, glancing at Laura while keeping his eyes on the road. Laura stared out the window, still shaken. "No one. Besides you, only me. I was working alone, and by the time I realized what I'd gotten into, it was too late. I thought I could hide, but they found me faster than I expected." Carlos understood now that everything hinged on the information Laura had uncovered. They needed to act fast, because those hunting them would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. Hours later, they reached a temporary safe house, an off-the-grid location Carlos knew would buy them some time. They couldn't stay long, but for now, they were safe. Carlos sat down with Laura, trying to figure out their next move. The only way they could survive this was to expose everything Laura had discovered. Laura handed Carlos a flash drive, the same one she had been carrying with her since her escape. "It's all here. The transfers, the names, the accounts, everything," she said, her voice still shaky. Carlos took the flash drive, feeling the weight of responsibility in his hands. "We need to get this to someone we can trust. Someone who can make it public before they catch up to us," he said. Before they could finalize their plan, the sound of approaching cars shattered the brief silence. Carlos looked out the window and saw the headlights of several black SUVs pulling up in the distance. "They found us," Carlos whispered, a sinking feeling settling in his chest. Carlos and Laura knew time was running out. With the cars rapidly approaching, their original plan to escape discreetly had been compromised. They were trapped. The small cabin they were using as a hideout was isolated, but the people chasing them were relentless, and the sense of being hunted intensified with every passing second. "We have to run," Carlos said, grabbing the flash drive Laura had given him just moments earlier. "This information is the only thing that can save us." He knew the evidence on that drive could expose the entire network of corruption and illegal financial dealings that Laura had uncovered. But now, the priority was getting out alive. Laura nodded, her eyes locked on the window where the headlights from the approaching cars lit up the horizon. "If we can get this to the press, they won't be able to touch us," she said, but there was uncertainty in her voice. The weight of what they were carrying was immense, and she knew the people chasing them wouldn't stop until the truth was buried. The two slipped out the back door of the cabin, running into the cover of darkness. The sound of the cars grew louder, and the footsteps of their pursuers echoed in the distance. They knew they were being followed, and Carlos, gun in hand, was prepared for the worst. As they ran through the dense forest that offered some cover, Carlos and Laura moved as silently as possible, but the tension was palpable. The fear of being caught grew with every step they took. Carlos knew that if they didn't make it out, the secret Laura carried would die with them. After a frantic sprint through the trees, they stopped behind a large oak, out of breath, trying to listen for their pursuers. The lights and sounds of the men tracking them were close. Carlos knew they couldn't hide for long. Laura, still panting from the run, gripped Carlos' arm. "There are too many of them. We won't be able to get out on our own," she said, her voice filled with fear. Carlos nodded in agreement but knew they had no choice. "We have to try," he replied, clutching the flash drive. For a brief moment, the forest was silent, and they watched as their pursuers moved further away without noticing them. It was the opportunity they needed to slip away unnoticed. Carlos led Laura deeper into the woods, taking a longer route that would hopefully throw off anyone chasing them. Minutes later, they reached a deserted road. Carlos knew they couldn't stay there for long, but they had managed to buy themselves some time. Laura began to catch her breath, though they both knew this wasn't over yet. If we can find a car or some way to contact someone, we can send the information out before they find us, Carlos said, his voice filled with urgency. Laura nodded, still shaken but determined. Just then, headlights appeared in the distance. A car was approaching along the road. Carlos raised his hand to signal the driver, and to his surprise, the car slowed down and stopped in front of them. A middle-aged man sat behind the wheel, looking at them with suspicion. But after seeing the desperation on their faces, he opened the door. "You two need help?" he asked. Without hesitation, Carlos and Laura climbed into the car, and as they drove off, Carlos held onto the flash drive tightly. He knew that if they could get the information to a secure source, they might finally have a chance to bring down the people who were after them. It was now a race against time, and Carlos understood that the next step would be critical. To expose the truth, they would have to risk everything. Carlos and Laura had finally escaped the trap set by their relentless pursuers. With the help of a stranger who, luckily, had decided to assist them, they sped down the dark road, the flash drive containing all the evidence safely tucked away in Carlos's pocket. The plan was now clear: expose the truth to those who couldn't be silenced, deliver the information to a trustworthy source, and ensure the people responsible for the conspiracy were brought to light. As the car moved through the night, Carlos knew the battle was far from over. He understood that everything they had faced so far was just the tip of the iceberg. The web of corruption and criminal activity Laura had uncovered ran deep, filled with dangerous people in powerful positions. These individuals wouldn't give up easily, even if the evidence was handed over to the right people. Laura stared out the window, still visibly shaken from everything they had been through, but a growing sense of determination flickered in her eyes. "We've made it for now," she said softly, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "But we know this isn't over yet." Carlos nodded. He knew that exposing this information was just the beginning. There would be retaliation, and the people behind the conspiracy would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. Their only hope was that the truth would come out quickly enough to be impossible to cover up. Finally, they reached a small town where Carlos knew a trusted journalist. Someone who had exposed scandals in the past and wouldn't be afraid to publish something as explosive as this. Carlos and Laura stepped out of the car, feeling the weight of what they were about to do. The journalist, a middle-aged man with a strong reputation for integrity, greeted them with a serious expression. They handed over the flash drive and explained everything. The journalist promised to act fast, and as he began reviewing the evidence, Carlos and Laura sat quietly in the small office, waiting for confirmation that everything was in order. When the journalist returned, the look on his face said it all. "This is going to take down some very powerful people," he said. "But I'm in. We're going to expose every detail of this." For a moment, Carlos felt the weight lift off his shoulders. What had started as the disappearance of a young woman was now turning into something much larger, a chance for justice. Still, he knew the road ahead would be difficult. As Carlos and Laura left the journalist's office, the sun was beginning to rise. The war was just beginning, but they had won the first battle. The truth was on its way to being revealed.